Hello. Hi, welcome back to another installment of the Hen House at Home. I'm Monica Fernandez.
And I'm Toby Harper.
And thank you so much for joining us to celebrate our fall 2021 authors and their incredible books. Before we begin, we wanted to acknowledge that the land that Toby and I are broadcasting from is the occupied and seized territory of the Gabrielino, Tongva, and Kizh people. Tonight's event features novels that pull inspiration from real-world events, so we wanted to highlight an Indigenous author whose novel did the same. Based on the extraordinary life of National Book Award-winning author Louise Erdrich's grandfather, who worked as a night watchman and carried the fight against native dispossession from rural North Dakota all the way to Washington, D.C. The Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich, recently awarded the 2021 Pulitzer Prize in Fiction, explores themes of love and death with lightness and gravity, and unfolds with the elegant prose, sly humor, and depth of feeling of a master craftsman. It's a New York Times bestseller and has earned countless rave reviews, so be sure to pick up your copy before they're all gone. Also, catch our very own Kristen Miyares-Young in conversation with Louise at Seattle Arts and Lectures in November. Details for that event will be dropped in the chat in just a second. Tonight's event will be a reading and conversation with Red Hen authors Jaye Viner and Lily Hoang, whose novels are equally heart-wrenching and beautiful in their own ways. We're so excited for their self-guided conversation tonight and can't wait to listen in. Before we get started, we wanted to provide a brief content warning. The books we will be discussing tonight contain subjects that may be triggering for some audience members, including fat phobia, intense bullying, medical trauma, and subtle violence. Viewer discretion is advised. We're excited to welcome Jaye and Lily to the screen. Hello, hi. We are so looking forward to this. Toby and I will leave you to it, but we'll see you again at the end of the show. Bye.
Hi, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Monica and Toby and Kate and all of the hens. And thank you, Jaye, for sharing this virtual stage with me. It's my first time reading from my book, Underneath, which comes out, I think, in a couple of weeks. So before I begin, I just wanted to apologize that there is a lot of curse words. There will be a lot of curse words in my reading. It's all part of the dialogue. So I'll just start. And this is just from the beginning. Oh, I should have mentioned, the narrator is an 11-year-old girl, and she has been murdered by her mother, but this is told before it happens. She puts little Jimmy down, and she stops there for a minute. Martha is admiring her beautiful son, his perfection. She's thinking about something, and she's thinking hard, taking her time with it. Like, would she hear it first or feel it first, those tiny bones breaking? Like, if his fingernails are sharp enough to fray the cotton of her dress, like, would he have the instinct to fight? Like, so much flesh. She wants to, but no, she can't. She closes the door to my little brother's room. She closes the door to all those rushing desires, those nightmares, her fantasies. Little Jimmy is safely in his bed, and nothing bad is going to happen to him, and she's a good mother. Another one, Kenny calls. Martha rests for a second. She puts her weight against the hallway closet, and it creaks. Martha, you hear me? Nothing in the house is new. Not the furniture, not the washer, not the television, not the goddamn arguments, not even the clothes. Because, Kenny shouts, I can hear you breathing all the way from here. Go get me another beer, Jesus. Martha heaves herself forward. Coming, she says. I'm coming there straight away now. In 3 days, everything will be different. In 3 days, all of Martha's curiosities will be fulfilled. She will know everything she has ever wanted to know. She will be content. In 3 days, Martha will put down little Jimmy just like she does every day, once at 10 and once at 2:45. And 3 days from now, Martha will also feel tired. Imagination is a grand thing, but when obsession forces compulsion into action, something else comes out. It's kind of like the fight between what's imagined and what's real, like which one might taste better in the end. And for Martha, the realness of the moment will feel right, transcendent. It will feel like her very first victory. It will feel like the whole of her weight put on top of little Jimmy, and it will feel special, like nothing she's ever felt before, and her husband will have to get the next beer himself. She will repose her body on top of his for a while. She will have herself a little nap, with her son's small body lodged between the folds of her back, in 3 days' time. No sooner and no further into the future than anyone might predict either. But no one could have predicted this. Even after death, this story is always a surprise. So I'm going to skip a little bit forward to 3 days later. It is the narrator Arlene's birthday, and she's just pissed her mother off. And so she's kind of hiding. Outside, it is night, and the desert sky opens itself for the stars to make themselves be seen. These glorious fires, so bright even space can't hide them. Meanwhile, inside the house, the volume has been turned way up. I know the whole neighborhood can hear. Meanwhile, inside the house, Kenny goes, "Fuck's your problem." And Martha goes, "Fuck you, you're a shit and so is she." And Kenny goes, "You know what your problem is?" And Kenny goes, "You're a rack of shit. You're a shit, and your mama's a shit, and the only fucking good thing about you is Arlene and little Jimmy. There's a star inside me, ready to burst." And Kenny goes, "But you? Forget about you." He makes to turn around and leave, but then he stops. He goes right up to Martha's face and goes, "You're a bitch. I wish I'd never." Martha doesn't look at him. Her eyes are fixed on a bag of flour. "And you stink and you're gross. I mean, do you even shower? Have you even looked at yourself lately? Jesus, and do you ever hear yourself talk? You hear that stupid shit that comes out of that mouth of..." Martha measures 1.5 cups of flour, sifts in 1/3 cup of Hershey's cocoa butter, adds a big pinch of baking soda, and just a little one of salt. And eat and eat and eat. What am I even doing with you? I mean, Jesus. In another bowl, 1.5 sticks of butter, softened in the microwave, and a cup of sugar. Then 2 eggs until it creams together. A medium pour of vanilla extract and 2/3 cup sour cream. Should have known from the 2 men before me. I should have known. Your mama told me all about you. She sure as fuck did. Told me how you done ruined her life. Told me how those loser men before me told me I was too good for the likes of... She adds the wet ingredients to the dry, gently mixing. "And you're selfish and you're stupid. You ain't even finished high school. You're useless. Can't get a..." She greases 2 springform pans, delicately pours the batter in, picks up the pan and drops it flat on the counter to spread the mix out evenly. "The stupid one, not you. I'm the stupid one because I'm the one who married you. Me and half this town already, more like it. Don't matter. I'm the stupid one. What was I..." She pops it into the oven. Easy. Mistake of mine. 30 minutes and like magic, it's done. Have to pretend, you hear me? Shit, I can't get it up for you. You gotta be kidding me. Have you looked in the goddamn mirror? Shit, you don't even... In a saucepan, 6 ounces semi-sweet chocolate broken into chunks, 3/4 sticks of butter, all on low until it bubbles. Martha removes it from the heat, lets it cool. She whisks in a tablespoon of simple corn syrup, 1/2 cup of sour cream, and 1 short pour of vanilla extract. She quickly whips in 2.5 cups of powdered sugar until it stiffens, until it hardens. She puts it in the refrigerator to cool and set. Couldn't fuck you if I tried. I have to pretend you're some other bitch, you hear me? Forget about something as sweet as lovemaking. Forget about it. No way, ain't. The cake cools on a rack for 30 minutes. Martha pops the spring latches and releases the 2 cakes. She spoons a thick layer of icing and spreads it out. She lays 1 cake atop the other and slathers more icing everywhere. It's green and very creamy. And thank fucking God I ain't have no kids with you. It'd be better for those kids if you just died, because even the state would take better care of them. Then Martha eats the cake right there, standing over the stove. The oven's still going, so it's warm on her belly. It makes her sweat. She doesn't look at Kenny. She doesn't bother dividing it into slices, just fork after fork, into and out of your mouth, your crude and ugly, stupid mouth. What have I done with my life? What have you done to me? And on he goes. You're such a selfish bitch, that's what you are. He sacks town after town, burning everything along the way. Insult after insult, right on the sweet spot. He goes on like that for hours. Martha never looks at him. Her face is serene, contemplative, baking cake after cake, making each one disappear into her crude and ugly and stupid mouth. Kenny pauses sometimes like he's about to let up, but then he just starts going again. He's an object in motion and nothing wants to stop him. She is the culprit. She is to blame. Everything is because of her. Martha never speaks, says not a single word. No sound comes from her mouth except chewing and swallowing. Yes, she is swallowing everything Kenny is saying, every last crumb. Her eyes are composed. She is looking away to a distant land, to a time long, long ago. Meanwhile, Jupiter is out tonight. Jupiter, I learned in school, is huge. I know all about the planets, like how Jupiter's gravitational field is what protects the Earth from meteors and comets. Even if I were outside tonight looking up at the sky, I doubt I'd be able to tell Jupiter from any other ordinary thing sparkling way up there. And then, in an instant, everything changes. A door is slammed, an engine turns over, the suddenness of quiet. It's reckoning. In the morning, Kenny takes a shower, but Martha hasn't bothered to set out his scrubs, and the coffee in the pot is tepid and too strong. Martha is frying bacon in the microwave. Babe, Kenny says. His hair is still wet. You know I'm sorry. Martha turns to him crying, says, I know. She opens her arms to her husband and he falls into her. He nestles his face into the cotton of her house dress. It smells exactly like her, the woman he loves. 3 days later, Martha just can't help it anymore. She puts little Jimmy down for a nap and suddenly Martha feels tired too. Maybe she should take herself a little snooze. She lifts herself onto the bed. She cuddles around little Jimmy. Her love, her love. He smiles and grabs his feet. Her joy. He laughs that laugh of his and puts his purple monkey into his mouth. So Martha adjusts herself by placing her body on top of his. And then she rolls back and forth and back again until he is dead. Thank you.
Good evening, Lily. That was a great reading. I just read the book, but it's such a different experience actually hearing it from your words and your inflections. So thank you for that. So I'm going to pivot a little bit in tone and a lot of it in content. My book, Jane and Battery Park, is what one might call a romantic thriller in the vein of Romeo and Juliet, where you can think of Jane, the main character, is coming from a family where they kind of run a cult that puts celebrities on trial for their sins to try and kind of reform pop culture in America. And the love interest, Daniel, is a has-been Hollywood heartthrob who's kind of in between projects right now, and he comes from a family of Hollywood royalty. And the scene I'm going to read to you is about kind of Jane's everyday life and the moment that it's interrupted when she encounters this movie star family for the second time. So I'm not going to tell you about the first time, but this is very early in the book. And one of the things that is relevant for our conversation tonight that I kind of want you to think about is the way that people who have experienced trauma adapt to doing their regular life. And so this is a very much like a regular day scene where you can kind of see all the ways that she's figured out how to manage to be an everyday sort of functional person. And she lives just on the margin of like, I'm doing my life versus one thing's going to go wrong and then it all falls apart. And of course, because it's a thriller, everything eventually falls apart, but not today. All right. The traffic in LA was reason enough for the most even-keeled person to lose their mind. But Jane liked the traffic. It made her feel like she was part of something. She had plenty of other ways to lose her mind. Phantom husbands in restaurants, for one. Eating fast food every day, a habit that made her life in LA feel impermanent. That was another. She wiped at the fallen shredded cheese and lettuce in her lap as she drove to work and resolved to do more cooking and less Taco Bell. Sleep deprivation was another way the darkness crept in. Coming home from a hectic night shift at the hospital, a spider had found Jane. Fuzzy and black, its body the size and perfect roundness of a quarter, it had dodged her flying shoe and made for the bed where it hid itself in the clutter, and Jane hadn't been able to work up the courage to go in after it. 6 hours trying to sleep on the Goodwill couch in the living room without light blocking curtains did not a happy Jane make. The ticking of the AC unit felt menacing. The sounds of the neighbor's footsteps outside became portents of doom. The spider added to what had already been a surreal night. At work, a patient recovering from a procedure that put 20 screws in her shattered femur had started bleeding internally. Jane had discovered it while helping her to the bathroom. She kept saying that it was just bruising from the jet ski accident, and then she flatlined. When Jane had finally left at 8:30 that morning, the patient was still in surgery, and the outcome hadn't looked good. It took hours for the combined adrenaline of the patient's emergency and the spider's invasion to wear off enough that Jane could sleep. Sort of. When her alarm sounded, Jane was already half conscious, trying to ignore a lump in the couch cushion that bit into her thigh. Her daily inspirational quote appeared in pink and purple hearts on her phone screen. When you say it's hard, it means I'm not strong enough to fight for it. Stop saying it's hard. Think positive. Because one exclamation point wasn't enough, the text used 3. Jane gave her phone a good shake and asked how positively it would be thinking if she only recharged it for 2 minutes instead of 30. She dragged herself into a sitting position and kicked at the bottom of the couch. Time to start the day. Taco Bell was the savior of bad planners and the ill-prepared. Jane piloted her Jeep through the asteroid field of the LA freeway system while eating a taco and singing along to Elton John. Her singing poured out the windows into a smoggy afternoon, almost carefree. She still felt a nudge at the back of her head that something was wrong. She pushed it away with rational justifications. The spider invasion, the patient who might now be dead by the time she got to work. But it was more than that. An entire course of Rocket Man passed while Jane flitted through the possible things wrong that might be bothering her until she found the right one. I didn't arm the alarm. Jane stomped the brake and swerved onto the oncoming exit ramp. 2 lanes of drivers laid on their horns in righteous fury. Elton carried on his merry singing, oblivious, while Jane calculated the time it would take to turn around, drive home, arm the alarm, and start off for work again. In the past, she'd forgotten, and it had been okay, but with the spider and that patient last night, Jane felt the universe conspiring against her more than usual. She pulled into the condo parking lot as Elton announced, "The bitch is back," to the kids showing off their surfboards in the adjacent In-N-Out. This was home, a two-tower high-rise, not quite in Santa Monica. There was no ocean view and no security guard in the parking lot to watch the gate that rolled open for anyone and their dog. Literally, Jane once saw it open for a man walking a St. Bernard. The ocean was out there somewhere because families in swimsuits stopped off from Highway 1 to grab snacks and cheap towels from the neighborhood CVS. But it was part of another world. Here, there was no salt spray in the air, just fast food grease and exhaust. The condo stairway smelled like a swamp. Jogging up 5 stories in flip-flops, not recommended, but Jane's sneakers were in her locker at the hospital. Elton's voice crooned up at her as she clapped her way up to her unit. Outside her door, Jane paused to investigate for any sign of forced entry. Silly, but she couldn't help it. Shayla across the way had a dachshund and a mother who owned the unit Jane subleased, so her name wouldn't show up on any online housing directories. They were just stepping out for a walk. Such a nice thing, mothers and daughters who took walks together. Shared common interests? Pets? Jane's mother had withheld cookies when she couldn't recite Bible verses without mistakes. Jane ducked inside to avoid talking to them. On the alarm panel, Jane punched in her code, hit arm, and started off again. Jogging down the stairs, she ditched the flip-flops, and offered the soles of her feet to whatever bacteria were feeding on the damp cement. Off to work for real this time, Jane skipped the CD back to, I guess that's why they call it the blues, unwrapped her second taco, and spewed some half-masticated shell onto her steering wheel when she tried to resume singing. Everything was fine. The East Nurses Station and the West Nurses Station on the 7th floor of the hospital were divided by the elevator. Each desk was staffed by 2 nurses per shift. The East 7 day shift desk only had 1 nurse left, since Jane was so late. Grace wasn't quite snarky enough to look at the wall clock when Jane walked in, but she did check the computer clock when she grabbed her purse on the way out. Grace knew nursing, but her bedside manners, her table manners, basically all her manners oozed sticky condescension that Jane just couldn't do with today. Alma, best shift partner ever, had already arrived. She looked the way Jane felt, like they'd both been inflated by a blueberry in Willy Wonka, and it was easier to roll than walk. She spilled an impressive number of antihistamines, antacids, nauseas, Dayquil, and Advil onto her half of the station's desk. She pitched forward and let her head crash into Jane's shoulder. I think I'm dying. Did the jet ski lady make it out alive? Jane asked Grace. More than alive. Grace lowered her voice and leaned forward in a way that made it feel like they were almost friends. She might be Steve Fletcher's mom. Really? But she said she didn't know him, so maybe not. Who doesn't know Steve Fletcher? Alma sounded like she was wearing a clothespin on her nose. Doesn't she watch movies? Even Jane knows Steve Fletcher. No offense, buddy. I called her listed emergency contact twice last night, said Jane. No answer. Jane tried to rehearse the things that had happened in the night, the possible, impossible pieces of information pulling together. She couldn't remember looking at the patient's name when she'd made that phone call. The orderly had done that part of the job, she thought. Alma opened Fletcher's patient file. There's no name on either of the contact numbers. We'll call now and see who answers. God, I'd die to meet Steve, or his gorgeous brother. What's his name? The guy who was in Slut way back when? Daniel, Alma and Jane say together. Grace handed Jane a copy of the shift report. Jane pretended to read it until Grace's attention was on her phone. Then she shot bug eyes at Alma. Call, mouthed Alma. It's a really common name, Jane hedged as she stared at a pair of 10-digit numbers that might summon Daniel to the hospital. It seemed impossible that she'd called him the night before. After all this time, he was suddenly so close. Jane wished Grace would finish checking her phone and leave. I'm not starting my day until you call. Alma held her Diet Coke with her free hand suspended over it, waiting to pop the tab and pour it into her water bottle. Along with various other delusions that came from a reality co-created with science fiction, Alma believed that climbing the stairs once a week and drinking her Coke from a pink ribbon water bottle would magically get her in shape for Race for the Cure. It was an endearing and beautiful self-delusion that suddenly made Jane want to cry. Alma glared at Grace. I'll text you if they show up. You better. Grace grabbed her purse again, whisked down the corridor. They heard her excited whispers with the West 7 nurses as she waited for the elevator. You have to call, said Alma. And say what? Well, that his mom's in the hospital and had to be rushed into surgery last night? Jane still didn't reach for the phone. Alma took her hand. You've been thinking about this guy for as long as I've known you. If he's even half as perfect as you think, you have to try this. He probably doesn't remember me. Well, then you'll help him remember. Well, maybe he's turned into an arrogant prick. Well, then you'll be able to cry and move on. Jane pushed away a giddy rush of hope as she reached for the phone. She dialed the first number on the contact. It immediately went to voicemail. An automated message repeated the number and told her to leave a message after the tone. Well? Asked Alma. The phone is off. We'll try the other one. Jane hung up and dialed the second number. The phone rang almost 6 times before it picked up. A rich baritone slurred into Jane's ear. Who is this and how'd you get this fucking number? Anyone who watched movies knew that voice. Not Daniel, but his older brother, Steve. Hello? Hello? Start fucking talking or I'm hanging up. Yes, this is Jane at the... Is this about my mother? She's not getting out any earlier than the doctor says, and I'm not pulling any fucking strings for her this time. There was a complication. She had heart surgery last night. Is this a fucking joke? My mother's heart is fine. Who is this? I'm the night nurse. Her accident caused more trauma than we initially thought. She's stable right now. We have visiting hours tomorrow afternoon. Jane added this last piece of information because she was a professional, even though what she wanted more than anything was for Steve, and hopefully Daniel, to visit during her shift that night. You're serious? Steve now sounded bewildered instead of angry. The line went quiet. Jane heard a woman's voice murmuring in the background. Then Steve's voice returned to the line. So my brother usually handles these things. Jane's breath caught in her throat. She nearly choked as she said, Do you want me to call him? No, he's out of town. I feel like you're saying that she might not make it. Or is that what you're saying? I'm just the nurse. Right, thanks for that. The line went dead. Alma was staring, waiting, but Jane couldn't think of anything to say. It'd been so long since she'd considered the possibility of seeing Daniel again. Real flesh and blood Daniel, not the dream of him that she'd constructed in her head. And? Asked Alma. It was Steve. Oh, fuck. I'm going to go do rounds. Are you kidding me? Well, if he comes, he comes. Fine, be that way, but I know you. You're not as calm as you look. Jane was never as calm as she looked, but she'd learned to survive by pretending. Alma wasn't the only one who ran her life with a carefully curated collection of self-delusion. She worked her way around the 7 West with steely, single-minded focus. The hip replacement grandmother of 16 perfect children told Jane that her water jug was empty. Maybe she'd repeated herself a couple of times while Jane stood with her back to the bed, pink dry erase marker poised in the air while Jane tried to remember how to spell her own name. The patient in the next room wanted ice chips instead of ice cubes, and could Jane bring her another heated blanket? On break, she went down to the ICU and checked on Rhea Fletcher. She was asleep, listed as stable. Jane stood for a few minutes at the end of her bed, trying to see Daniel in her face. She wondered if Daniel had ever told his mother about the girl he'd once met in Battery Park. Stop there. All right. So, for the rest of the evening, Lily and I are going to discuss kind of the main themes in our book. So we have lots of overlapping themes. And I first wanted to start by asking Lily to talk about kind of the inspiration for Underneath. So this is based on a true story, and it's quite astounding true story. And what inspired you to write a novel from that story, and how did you go about it?
Thanks. So first off, awesome reading. I'm glad we got to end on the Battery Park bit. That was really fun. So I've been writing. I wrote this novel and I rewrote it. I've been obsessed with this story for more than 10 years. I think I was just one day looking up serial killers on Wikipedia, as one does, right? And then I noted that for the most part, it's like the male serial killers are known as like the genius masterminds, and female serial killers are categorized as either Black widows or mercy killers, so nurses, etc. So women are very easily categorized into these like camps of serial killer. But then I came across this woman, Martha. And she, in the 80s, used her body to roll over her 4 children and murder them. And I mean, that was, I think it was the corporality of it, right? Like the body that gave life to these children then became the body that took it away. And the murders ranged from 3 months to 11 years old. So Arlene is 11, but the other 3 children that were killed were under 3 years old. And so you can imagine, it's a smaller human. But something about Arlene and being 11 and knowing the entire time that her death was imminent, it was just a haunting thing. And so it became really an obsession. And all I could think about was Martha and this really frightening woman. And I think to me, the most difficult part about writing this novel was not understanding the motive for murder, right? I could understand feeling so disempowered that the only way that you can feel any sense of power is to do something so heinous. I could get that, which I think says something very troubling about me. But I had a difficult time understanding how she moved through the world. So the real Martha is my height. I'm 5'1", and 250 pounds. And I think the most difficult part in writing this book for me was just understanding how she walked and how she sat and what her body felt like and how people judged her. Because we are a society that values thinness so much, right? And so, yeah, I think that was it. It was trying to get into that point of view and understanding disempowerment and the urgency to feel some kind of agency, even though it's completely misguided and it's awful. Yeah. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this horrible, what makes a monster, and really what makes a monster, right? Like, what are the events that transpire to make a person into someone who is monstrous? I think I'm gonna ask your question back to you in a slightly different way. So we got pretty much the beginning of your novel, right? So what was the genesis point of your novel? And in early drafts, where did the story begin? Did it always begin in the mundane ways in which one tries to survive trauma, or did it begin elsewhere?
So like you, I have had a long road with this book. I think I had a complete draft somewhere in 2012. And my initial impetus was 2 things. I was challenged at a writer's conference to, instead of write what was familiar, was write and explore the thing that frightened me. And at the time I was in my 20s, I felt invincible. I didn't really have a lot of things that frightened me. But within a year of that writer's conference, I had 2 very frightening experiences that kind of undermined my faith in the cosmos. And one was I found a giant spider in my kitchen that I almost stepped on in the dark, and then found myself cowering on the kitchen counter, which is a scene in the book. And then the second one was I went to a very routine cardiologist appointment and had a gung-ho, fresh out of medical school doctor tell me that maybe my heart would rupture and that I should watch out for chest pain, which was exciting. And so there's actually nothing wrong with my heart, but it's amazing how much the power of those words spoken by someone in authority changes how much you trust your body. And so those 2 experiences kind of began the thematic development for Jane at Battery Park, where I was exploring my experience with anxiety over something that was drastically affecting my life without any concrete problem. So I didn't have a heart condition, but maybe I did because someone had said I did. And that really came into my experience working with Daniel, who experiences very concrete physical trauma, but at the point where we see him in the novel, he's recovered physically, but mentally there's this legacy of feeling that he's out of control, that his body is going to betray him basically at any moment, and that he's unworthy of a generous life and a film career because of that. So I started with that on Daniel's side, and with Jane, it's a lot less interesting in that I was irritated as a Midwesterner hearing about people, specifically news coverage on the coasts, talking about flyover country like it didn't matter, or that we were quote unquote crazy or uneducated, or somehow our behavior could not make any sense. And often that was convoluted with political messages, specifically about conservative religious belief systems. And so I thought that I was going to write a novel that defended flyover country, at least for a human perspective. Maybe not as we're quite rational, but we are people and we make decisions based on certain bodies of knowledge. And so Jane and her family background and this idea of trying to reform America by putting celebrities on show trial kind of came out of my experience being in the Midwest and my childhood growing up in evangelical purity culture, and the 90s power of the evangelical movement, which was very much about trying to reform not just politics, but popular culture, and specifically Hollywood. It's still doing that, by the way. And so I thought I was going to marry these two very disparate ideas of fear and trauma, and then what, existential, defining my life existence to coastal people. And I don't know that I quite achieved that, but that was what I started to do back 10 years ago. It's been a long road.
Oh no, that's great. Okay, so you started to touch on this in your previous response. So both of our novels deal with crime and criminality, and how characters justify that crime and criminality. My narrator, Arlene, the 11-year-old girl, I don't believe in justice conceptually. I just don't believe that it exists. How do you define justice, and how is that similar or different from Jane's understanding of the word? And I think especially because she grew up in this, I wouldn't even call it fundamentalist. I would say it's like this extremist religion where they, her brothers are putting people on trial.
I'd be honest in saying I don't think a lot about justice. And even when I read the description for your book, I had to sit and think a lot about the implications of justice, both in the context of your book and then just in general, because that isn't something that I think much about. And I don't know that Jane either thinks about it. I think that most of her conflict is based on what she's been taught in her life, and I think often if we have a sense of justice, it comes from our cultural norms, both the large society ones and the smaller personal, the family culture ones. And that Jane has been raised with certain rules about what's correct. And once she gets out on her own in California, those don't just fly out the door and she gets to choose new ones. She still has those values. And so she doesn't go to the FBI to report her brothers, even to prevent crimes. It's a huge struggle for her to betray what, to some extent, she believes is true, if only because that's what she's been taught. And one of the things that I think was important with Jane is exploring this idea that even when we stop believing something, if it's something that's been foundational to a truth to some extent in our life, it still comes through with us. And we have to systematically replace it with something, or at least find really good reasons to not believe that anymore. And I think most of Jane's struggle is about recognizing her own version of truth outside of her family's views. And I don't think that she quite arrives at justice necessarily, like if that's a state institutional procedural thing, or if that's personal justice and claiming a truth for herself, possibly. But even at the end of the novel, like that's still very much a complicated question for her, which I think makes it really interesting.
Yeah.
So since I've struggled with justice, and I know that's a big thing about how you're approaching this very complex story, what do you think? And how do you think justice is achieved with what you've done with the story?
Oh, yeah, no, I just I don't believe in justice. I don't believe that goodness is rewarded and badness is punished. I don't, I have not, I haven't seen evidence that this is true, that goodness is morally ethical, moral or ethical goodness is something that is rewarded. And so, you know, with this book, it was important for me to have the narrator be the little girl that gets murdered at the end, right? And so the rules of the world are very complex. I didn't read the introduction, but it's a little odd. So Arlene, after she is murdered, exists in this kind of nether world where all victims of murder go after they die. And then for an hour every day, they have to go and spend, they have to go and look at their murderer. And after the murderer dies, you go and look at their grave. And that's just like the weird rule of the world, which is a way that I can tell the story of the continuous present at the same time as the past. And so in fact, what the novel is doing is just saying, like, this poor girl witnessed her 3 siblings be murdered. Well, she didn't witness it, but she knew that her mother was the murderer. She knew that she was going to die. And there's nothing that she could do about it. And then it actually happens. She gets murdered. And now this is what she gets. She doesn't get heaven. She doesn't get relief. In fact, she's just suffering more. So I guess that's a really sad and negative view of things. Yeah, there's no happiness at the end, and I think that was a big problem for a lot of publishers, which is why I'm so grateful for Red Hen for being willing to publish something like this. Can we? I want to circle back. I mean, this is perhaps related to justice, but maybe not. So I think Americans as a whole have been trained to believe religious extremists exist in only one religion, and that's Islam. And your book is like, your book and other dystopian novels, right? So how did you build this religion? And then how did you come up with the trial? And I mean, and can you explain that to the audience a bit? The particularities of that trial, because it's so frightening, and yet I think it speaks to the way that we as humans want to witness terrible things, like we just want to see it, like a car accident, right?
Right. So there are a couple of things, and they're both actually grounded in pop culture, as one would hope for something like this. The one came from watching a British television show called Spooks or MI5. I can't remember which is the American title, but it's a very traditional spy thriller, like James Bond, except serialized. And there was an episode that I watched sometime in 2012 where they are pursuing terrorists, just like regular terrorists, who are putting the 1% on show trials, like live streamed, like they kidnap them, take them to a warehouse, and they basically read a list of their wealth and extravagances, and then they get shot. Or if MI5 intervenes, then they don't get shot. And I was really intrigued by this idea of vigilante justice that doesn't come from a superhero movie. And I was also really intrigued by the fact that I had a lot of sympathy for those terrorists because I was involved in the movement, the 99%. And I thought that they had some really good reasons for what they were doing, not necessarily killing people, but trying to draw attention to the fact that these people were really contributing to a lot of the world's problems, and there was no accountability. So that was the beginning of the possibility, and I started thinking about, well, from my perspective, well, what does show trial look like? Because obviously I couldn't do the 1% because they did that already. And the idea evolved based on my cultural experiences of, well, you know, evangelicals have been trying to reform Hollywood and make Hollywood much more family friendly for a long time. And so that hasn't been especially successful, although we could argue to some extent it has, especially with limitations on what kind of love we see on screen, how we see abortion on screen. Those kinds of things are generally very conservative. But I started thinking about what vigilante justice would look like for show trials from that perspective. So if they were going to try and kind of shame celebrities, you know, like the Scarlet Letter, by branding them if America found them guilty. So the thing that I was left discontent with the spy show was that the terrorists just did it unilaterally. And I thought, well, Americans, they would want in on that because American Idol, right? You can text your vote in. I don't know if they actually count those votes, but you feel like you're voting for someone, right? And you influence how the show goes. And so I thought that it would be very American where you could have this live stream trial where, you know, the Vanguard is the organization it's called, and they kidnap a celebrity that they obviously think is guilty. But then they conduct a trial that's live and everyone can watch, and then they vote based on the evidence. And if, you know, the majority of people vote innocent, then the celebrity goes on their way. And then if they're voted guilty, which more often than not happens because they're not choosing people they think are innocent, then they're branded, usually in a place of their body that represents kind of their area of sins, the classification of their sins, so that even though they can wear clothing and hide that branding, they're still aware of it, and it kind of changes how they think about their lifestyle. So nobody gets killed. And I actually thought that it was pretty tame for a version of terrorism to, I mean, they don't carry guns. They're not necessarily inherently violent people, but they really believe that this possibility of shaming and that celebrities seeing their fans declare them guilty of something would be a way to kind of change culture. Which I still think is inherently plausible and a little bit scary, and something we would totally do as Americans. Like, we have this disconnect when we're seeing something on a screen that, even though we know that it's invading somebody's rights and it's extrajudicial, that we're still going to sort of participate if we can get away with it, right? And you can get a VPN now, and you can vote, and nobody can track you, and it's anonymous, and you get to touch that person's life. I was writing this before we had Twitter and Instagram, where you can like comment on celebrity feeds and kind of like get in touch with them that way. And so I was very interested in this idea that Americans would want to be able to touch the lives of their celebrities for good or bad, right? And it would be a pop culture phenomenon. And even in the book, there are newspaper asides that kind of talk about these terrorists as, you know, there's one that's a fake Glamour article where it's talking about the butt cheeks of the various terrorists and whether or not it's okay to date other people if you're obsessed with the Vanguard. And I think that's very plausible in a horrible but kind of very typical American way.
I have a Scarlet Letter.
Oh, that's very literary.
I can't move my arm to match it. So maybe I've been asking questions, but I think that, you know, they're our things are so, there's a lot to talk about that is similar. So, you know, like you said that it took you 10 years to draft and redraft your book. It took me 10 plus years to draft and redraft and revise my book. It went from, you know, a 300-page novel to an 800-page novel to like a 120-page novella. And my agent submitted the manuscript, which was originally called The Book of Martha. And, you know, a bunch of publishers and editors were like really very generous in their praise of the book. But then ultimately they said no because they felt like the book left them feeling too hopeless.
Yeah. Mine was called Too Violent, which is interesting because there's actually no violence, just the hint of it. But so that brings me to an interesting question, in that I think that your book is actually quite controversial on several levels, especially for the publishing in this moment, with the way that we treat different identities and how they're represented in fiction, who tells what stories. And then also just the basic idea of, well, that there's populations of readers that want to like their main characters, right? Neither of us made that very easy, I don't think. But I was curious from your perspective, what you really want readers to get out of Underneath, and what you're hoping, what kinds of conversations come from reading your book.
You know, I don't know that I necessarily know the answer to that. I think I want readers to walk away feeling like Martha, who is this horrible human, is still a human, and that there was in fact perhaps there was not one reason that caused her to commit these murders. It was not one thing that made her a serial killer, right? It was the accumulation of an entire life that made her this monster. But short of that, you know, I'm not sure. I just wanted to build a very full character, and Martha is not likable, right? She's kind of a mean human, just as is. But even in the selection that I read, part of the reason why I chose that selection is for the audience to feel the verbal abuse that she had been withstanding, and then hopefully feel empathetic to her, right? Like, this poor woman is just getting screamed at, and her husband is screaming at her for so long that she has managed to bake like 8 cakes or something. And so actually in the first few drafts of this book, I was in an abusive relationship, and my husband would often just scream at me for hours, and nothing I did could prevent it. And so I felt such care for her as she was baking these cakes. It was heartbreaking to me. But then that empathy quickly changes, because the moment that you feel that connection to her, she goes and she murders a baby. And it's hard to then love her, right? I did want the reader to have a very complex and ambivalent relationship to her. One where we can understand her, and then one where she is just so foreign, completely alien to anything that we can understand. So I want to ask a different version of that to you. So where I was going before was like, with the publishing history, or the attempt to publish this book, several editors had said, you know, we'll publish this book if you let one baby live. You just need to let one of them survive. And I was like, nope, they all have to die. In part because I wanted to stick to the actual story of Martha's life. What was your experience with trying to publish Jane. And were there any concessions that you made? Like, I don't know, just what was the process? I think, you know, this is the question that we as writers, I often see my friends like roll their eyes about the process question, but that's actually what we all want to know, right? Like, how'd you do it?
So I will always answer the publishing question. Well, it is really luck. Like, there's the idea of the author having agency to make something happen, I think is a really completely illusion. The only thing you can choose to do is not give up. And how long you choose to not give up is really up to you. The publishing industry is such a trip. But there were a couple of concrete things that changed along the way. So I had finished this manuscript and had it rejected the first round of times by New York before I did my MFA, and I did my MFA. And the first major change that happened was that this was originally a 3 point of view novel. So right now it's Jane and Daniel, and then originally it also had Jane's husband Seth, who's the leader of the Vanguard. And I had written it because my original goal for this novel was to explore those divisions between coastal culture and Midwestern culture, and to really give a public human face to extreme belief, which is quite interesting now, where we have much more public versions of extreme belief than we did in 2012. Even just this year with the storming of the Capitol in January. And several of my faculty from the MFA said, well, this is really slowing the story down. You need to take it out. And nobody was particularly interested in Seth, which was hard for me to swallow. And
that's hard for me to swallow.
Yeah. And so it became very clear that, like, to make it work for somebody besides me, that it needed to be a little bit more streamlined between Jane and Daniel. So I did that, and I was still hanging on to the idea that it could really explore this cultural gap, and that was the main story, which is not very sexy. And so after graduation, I took it back to New York, and an agent who took the time to give me lots of comments and was really enthusiastic about the book said that it needs to be a traditional love story. And I said, I don't believe in traditional love stories. And she said, okay, whatever. So I thought about that for about a year. And then, like, you know, as your brain goes, you start thinking about, well, if I just, you know, this scene, and I could make it into a love story, and I wouldn't lose too much. And when I came on board with Red Hen, that most of the love story had been revised at that point. But then also when working with Kate, who's the editor at Red Hen, we definitely worked on the ending. I had Jane alone in a sushi bar, using the skills that Daniel had taught her to do true Japanese sushi, going off to start another life because she'd been found by her family. And Kate was just like, nope, we spent the whole time with them. They have to end up together. And I was like, but that's a love story. And so I guess I'm spoiling it, but, you know, we need happy books right now with pandemic. So spoiler, it's not a tragic version of Romeo and Juliet. They do survive to the end, and they are together. Yeah, so those are the two big concessions that I made. I think that the book,
I didn't want to give away the spoiler. I even have that in my notes. You're like, I don't want to give away the happy ending. But gosh, I was so happy for the happy ending.
A lot about me that I don't particularly care about that aspect of it being a spoiler. For me as a reader, that kind of, I don't care so much about that. We're so full of love stories like that. It's just like, that's how it has to happen. Okay, whatever. And you get other things out of it. Okay, so we are running out of time. I have to ask a last very good question, I guess. So I'm not going to ask all. I have a lot of structural writing questions, which are maybe not very interesting, but I'll frame it this way. So underneath has a lot of variety in the storytelling. So you have the narrator, Arlene, is consistent, but stylistically her voice changes throughout, and sometimes there are lists, and sometimes there's a lot of fluidity with time. So to not being very nerdy about this, when we're thinking about like emotional feelings and also this idea of portraying Martha as a human being, what were the decisions that you made to try and evoke that using these the variety of styles that you did?
Oh boy. So when I first wrote this book, it was written in first person, which is always limited, right? But then also kind of moving from character to character, except it was always Arlene. And so I was like, how am I going to make this point of view a real point of view? It's like stream of consciousness, but always Arlene plus someone else. And that's when I arrived at the ghost thing. I was like, oh, well, if Arlene is dead, then as a ghost, this is something that she can do. And so as Arlene gets closer to the characters, into their interior, she starts adopting their voice. And so that's when moments when she sounds very adult, it's because she's in an adult's head and she's experiencing these things as the adult. But, originally this book had a lot more weird forms. Like there's the 365.25 list of things that switches in the second person. There's another chapter that is divided by seasons to show the amount of time that passes. Mm-hmm. But there is this one chapter that Kate was very attached to, and I was as well, but for some reason I decided to take it out. And they were these letters that I wrote to the real Martha in prison. Except they weren't real. Like I didn't actually write Martha letters. I just imagined myself writing Martha letters, and she wrote me back as the author. And for some reason I was like, oh yeah, the epistolary, it's so over. I don't want to. But then as soon as I got the the PDF galley, I was like, oh no, I want my letters back in there. But by then it was too late. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like when I was writing this novel, I thought of each chapter as its own form that could that I can do whatever I want with, right? Like that I don't have to follow the same rules in every chapter as long as I consistently didn't follow the same rules for every chapter.
Right.
And so, yeah, no, I think this chapter gave me this book gave me a lot of room to play. And I think similarly, your book, right, as you said, there are these newspaper clippings and the glamour thing. We'll close on that. How did you, were there other forms, or were you thinking strictly of journalism? And of course, this was in 2012. I wonder if, given now how like Twitter and IG would have changed things.
So I originally started writing them because I wanted to have the third perspective of the cultural awareness of the Vanguard. Like you said, the limitation of having first person points of view, or in my case, both Daniel and Jane are close limited third person omniscient, where we're really focused on them. And so I wanted to give a sense of the scope of the Vanguard's influence on the greater culture. And I could really only do that through the voice of the culture, which was media. I don't know how I would represent it now with social media. The book is actually placed time frame wise even before 2012. Like the print icon is still an option, which doesn't exist anymore. So that is the only thing that can tell you what time frame it's in, unless you're really good with like how smartphones developed. But I wanted to have the audience know kind of what the Vanguard was doing out in the real world among regular people. And so I have basically newspaper, like the news, events, articles, and then I have kind of retrospectives, like think pieces, and then I have the very pop culture, like glamour, and then an interview with a celebrity who is on trial and is somehow making it into a way to rebrand herself. And so even though they're doing these horrible things, there's an element of the culture that's actually engaged with them and taken them in to be part of America, which I think is really fascinating. And I would love to write another book where I get to expand on that experience and have the characters not just be about a love story, but actually out in the world, being part of the broader culture that's experiencing the Vanguard.
I think you should write a follow-up from Seth's point of view.
Well, I have those. I think I've talked to Kate actually about having an ebook or doing like a Patreon or something with those chapters. And actually, so cool. The people that entered my Goodreads giveaway, they received bits of that. So there are 3 lucky people out in the world with some of that perspective.
I don't know. How about Seth now? Seth in 2021.
Well, I'll have to think about that. I haven't figured that out yet. All right. So we're going to invite Monica and Toby back, and we're going to wrap things up for tonight.
Yeah.
Hello.
Thank you guys so much. That was so great. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions because I know you both had such amazing ones. And I just loved hearing about the threads of your books and kind of the methods of both of them. And one of my favorite things about both of your books was that they both touch upon like social, what's it called? Like society. It has a statement about the way that society is today, whether it be about the treatment of Martha, who has been overweight her entire life, or the Vanguard. Like I loved, Jay, when I was reading your book, I loved reading about the Vanguard and like being horrified by how these people are like, as you mentioned during the event, like judging the butt cheeks of a terrorist and like falling in love with them and being obsessed with them and stuff like that. I was horrified, but also at the same time, I could totally see that trajectory in American culture today. So yeah, this was such a great event. So thank you both for this amazing conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Don't forget, if you purchase a copy of Jane of Battery Park or Underneath tonight, you'll get a bonus book in your package. Get your copies now. And I swear you need to pick up these books. Our next Hen House event will be on Thursday, so note the new day, October 7, 4 p.m. Pacific, featuring our fall short story collection authors Beth Gilstrap and Jim Peterson, with conversation moderated by Fred Arroyo. We hope to see you then, or you can visit us in person if you're in the LA area next week. We actually have 2 events where we can see your smiling faces again. October 1st at the Altadena Food Truck Friday, or October 2nd at the Village Studios in Los Angeles. Full details can be found on our Instagram. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We'll see you next time.